I'm Irene Curry. I've lived here my entire life until I went away to college. And when I went away to college, I came back, I was married and had one child. But this is my church. My husband was, who I met in college, never belonged to a church. His parents did, of course, but he never belonged. And when we came back here with our child, he wanted to belong to a church before we had our child baptized or christened, as they do in this church. And he joined here with, my parents all came out of this church, my grandmother. I can remember coming when I was as young, maybe as 5. But before that, I don't have any memory. But I've been coming here ever since. And my daughter, of course, I'm very proud of her. She's very active in the church now. But I've lived here. The pastor at that time was Reverend Walter Williams, who became like a surrogate father. I mean, we looked up to him. He was cared for the children that grew up here in the church. And he encouraged me to continue my education and all of that. I don't know whether he expected me to get married as young as I did, but nevertheless, he was very supportive. And the older people in the church also, I looked up to them. They were, I don't know the word I want to use, but they were Christian women who looked after you. Even though my mother wasn't here all the time, I knew that some lady was watching me to see that I was doing the right thing as a child growing up. And of course, I'm still here, thank God. I'm 82 years old, and I'm still here. Thank God for that.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question. Tell me about your family business.
My family business is Snowden Funeral Home, and it started in Howard County in the early 1900s with my grandfather. Someone told him, why don't you move to the county seat of Montgomery County, and he moved to Rockville. And he bought a house that's still there, the same location. And he was getting older, and my father and mother were living in New Haven, Connecticut. And my grandmother called and told my father to come take over your father's business. And my father took over in 1936.
And that's where you lived?
I used to live there. One half of the house was home, and the other was the funeral home. You know, the funeral home is right across the street, across the field. And that's where I grew up and lived there until I married. And when I came back here, there were no places for blacks to rent, very segregated, until we heard that Stearns, who owned the furniture store, was building apartments in Lincoln Park. And that's where I moved in 1957 with my husband, and by that time I had 3 children. But that's where I started. But my parents lived at the funeral home until 1971.
How many in your family?
There's just my brother and I. My brother passed away 2 years ago, very suddenly, so I'm the only one. They said I was the spoiled daughter that my father spoiled. But he's been gone for 34 years, so. My mother lived to be 96. I hope I have some of her genes. However, my father died at only 74. So I'm hoping I have some of her genes, and maybe it'll give me a couple more years of living.
I think maybe you do. All right, Annie.
My name is Annie Rhodes, and I was born with the assistance of a midwife on Martin's Lane, which is still there, and grew up in this church. I was a Sunday school student, I was a Sunday school teacher, and a Sunday school superintendent. And I had an older sister, and she was very emphatic about doing the right thing. So when she gave up being superintendent after 25 years, then I remember that I took it, and one year Irene and I were co-superintendents together, where Sunday school was growing. So, but I walked from my home on Martin's Lane to the black elementary school over by the bank now, where the bank is now on Beale and North Washington Street. And from there, my education was at Lincoln High School, which is still the building standing, but is now a church. And I remember cutting through a field, and the man's name was Jim Veers, and we would cut through because it was a long route otherwise. And he would come out with his cane and curse at us, and we'd run, and the next day would be the same thing. He never left his porch, the front of his porch, because he just was like that. And I work now at the senior center, and one of his in-laws works there with me, and she said that it's by her husband, said he was one of the meanest men that ever lived. So we lived through that. But anyway, and after my high school education, I went to D.C. to Miners Teachers College for my degree, and ended up teaching. My first job was on Martin's Lane at the new school that was built for blacks. There were 3 built in the county, and that was one of them. And I could walk to work. That was a thrill. It was rough growing up in Rockville, but my parents always told me I could be whatever I wanted to be, and to treat everyone right, and to love everyone. And I've always had that in my mind. And another thing my mother told me, never go shopping if I didn't have money. And I've taught my children that, because so many times youngsters go shopping and they see something and they don't have money, they get into trouble with stealing. And I've tried to pass that on to other youngsters, because it is a temptation when you go in candy or whatever. But I've enjoyed my life here in Rockville. I've only moved once in my life, 4 miles up the road to Deerwood. And sometimes I tell people, but I've traveled a lot. I'm not just a country bumper. And the life here has been good, been good.
We're going to get into a lot more, but that was a great beginning. So Nina, you did not grow up in Rockville. So tell me, first of all, start with who you are, and tell me where you grew up and what your family house was like.
Yes, my name is Nina Honeyman Clark, and there is a story behind that Honeyman. My grandfather was a slave, and he was always with his slave master, and everybody called him Honey's man. And he drove the buggy and everything. And I was born on Peachtree Road, higher up in the county, near Poolsville. And I went to school up there. My father was one of the people who in the community was able to get a school for our community. My father was very busy in this community. He was an odd fellow man. He was a superintendent of Sunday school. He was a That was Jim Honeyman. But my name, Honeyman, when they called my grandfather Honey's man, and when he was freed, he wanted 2 names. His name was Joseph. That's all he had when he was a slave. He wanted 2 names like everybody else. So he took that Honey's man and dropped some of the letters and fixed them, and we came out with H-O-N-E-M-O-N-D, Honeyman. That was our middle name. If you see that anywhere, that's some of my relatives, because nobody has that name. All the Honeymans I've ever heard was M-A-N on the end, but we are M-O-N-D. And I was born up there on Peachtree Road, where the Horines Peach Orchard is now. He lived right across the road. And we had a large family. There were 10 of us. In fact, there were 12 of us, but 2 of them died in childbirth. My mother and father raised 10 of us. And you know, I never remember growing up with my older sisters and brothers, because there were so many of us. We just kept coming and coming, and I'm the baby girl, and they always let me know that. And I'm left-handed, and my sisters wouldn't teach me how to cook or sew or knit or anything that you had to use your hands. Say, get out of the way, you're left-handed, you're doing it backwards. But I was sort of pampered because I was the baby girl. And all of my sisters and brothers are dead now, but me. I had 3 brothers and there were 7 girls. And all my family dead. I did not have a schoolhouse to go to when I first started school at 6 years old. We had 5 acres of land there, right across the road from the Horines peach orchard. And let me see.
We were going to talk about your school.
Oh, my schooling, yeah. We didn't have a schoolhouse. We never had a schoolhouse for many years. But we went to school in any building that we could have in our community. The church, the old house, and the dance hall, and anything that would hold one teacher and some children. That's where we went to school. And that school was the Oddfellows' old dance hall, built on our property. And I went to school there first. But the Ku Klux Klan burned it down. They didn't want us to have an education. So they burned our old building. We had to go into the church, the little church there, and it was named Jerusalem also, Jerusalem Baptist Church. And it's still standing, and it's going full speed ahead. But that's where we had to go to have, and I liked it being in the church. It had a balcony, just like this church. And if you did your work well, Miss Thomas was our teacher. She would let us go up and sit up in the balcony. And we thought we were something. We could go up in the balcony and sit. And but we had to go into the church. And then along came Mr. Julius Rosenwald. He was a fine Jewish man. He built, in 15 states, he built some schools out of his own pocket for black children. First, he went to Russia to help his people, but they were living pretty badly over there. So he went and he built some houses for his people in Russia. When he got back from Russia, he decided, I'm going to do something for black children. So Mr. Rosenwald built in 15 states in the South. They were long, old wooden buildings. They weren't pretty. And some of them, most of them were just 1 room. And then we had some with 2 rooms, and we had a few that had 3 rooms, the larger the community. And the way we had to get that school, the black people had to raise half of the money, and the other half came from Mr. Rosenwald's pocket. And we would have a group of our parents go to see the superintendent and say, we want a school in our community. And they would get together, they'd have dinners and this and baseball games to get this money to take to Mr. Burham. Ed Burham was our superintendent. And we had quite a time. You know, we were kind of packed in. And we had so many children till the older children had to help the little children. But I was a little child, and she called me, come on here now, my little old teacher. And I was second grade. Get over here with Hilton Jackson now and help him with his words. And I was scared of him because he was getting bit on his chin and had a man's voice. And here I was sitting up there beside Hilton, my little feet up here, and Hilton was sitting down there. You know, Hilton was a great big man. I was sort of scared of him, but Miss Thomas made me sit with him and help him with his work.
Let me ask you this. Was that when you were at the Rosenwald School?
No, that was when we were in the dance hall, and before the Ku Klux Klan burned it down. That was on our property, and I was just second grade, and I would always finish my work quicker than anybody else. And she said, "Come on now, little teacher, get over here and help Hilton." And I was scared to death of him. He had a man's voice.
Okay.
And he had beard on his face.
Wow. I'm gonna ask you a little more in a little bit about your school and the Ku Klux Klan in Poolesville, but I want to bring it back around right now to just find out how this church. I know that you went to Jerusalem Baptist growing up, but now you've been at this church. How did this church get its start? I think it has a very interesting story. Who wants to tell that one?
And he'll tell it.
This church was originally a white church, and blacks could come and sit up in the gallery, or on a hot summer day, the windows were open, they could stand in the windows and listen. And because of segregation, there was a friction all around. And so the white congregation went around the corner to West Montgomery Avenue and purchased land and built a new church. And I think this church was bought with $1, if I'm not mistaken, for $1. And my grandfather and other relatives and members who had been attending, they tore the building down and built where we are now. My grandfather, my uncles and aunts were all members here, and he was quite young at that time when this all happened. But he and his oldest son paid for, because the windows were all paid for by individuals, paid for that window. And every Sunday, my mother and I, my family sat on this side, but Papa would always come and sit by that window. And it always has meant a lot to me. And I remember once or twice I sat there with him because it meant a lot to all of us. And I remember as my grandfather grew older, he never drove a car, and he would walk from below Richard Montgomery to church. And it just hurt me. So finally I got a car, and he wouldn't let me come get him. He said he needed the exercise, but I always take him home every Sunday. We were very close. He wasn't as tall as I am, and that's not very tall, but he was a lovable guy.
So he's one of the founders.
Yes.
Yes. What was his name?
Asbury Johnson.
Asbury Johnson. Okay, good. What role did church play in your life as a child?
Church played a great role in our family, because you see, we didn't have too many things to occupy our time outside of church. We had to make our whatever churches or baseball games and things like that, because we couldn't go. We had to make our own. Well, anyway, I went to Jerusalem Baptist Church. It's on Jerusalem Road near Poolesville. And we went to church all the time. Sometimes we had church services at night. And we weren't afraid to walk from Peachtree Road over to Jerusalem. You know, we went skipping along and everything was just fine. Nobody said did anything to us, so we would go. And my father was superintendent of Sunday school, And he would start right after Easter, out of his own pocket, buying little gifts for his Sunday school children that will happen in December. And because he didn't have much money, so it took all the summer he would buy it, and then he would hide it in his hall, in the closet upstairs, to keep us out of it. And we would go and have all of our programs at night. And we would walk to church, and we would just as happy as little birds. And nothing ever happened to us.
Church, when I grew up here, of course, Rockville was very segregated. Church was a part of your life. From Sunday school, we had a Methodist Youth Fellowship. From that, we had young adults. And back then, this church we had a sister church in Norbeck, and we had services at 8 o'clock at night. But you knew, and your parents were insisted, you didn't do anything on Sundays but go to church. The things that I remember so well is we had a purpose in that there was Easter. We had to learn our parts and do plays and sing. For Children's Day, for Christmas, all of those, we had activities right here in the church. We don't do that anymore. I guess we've outgrown that stuff, but that was our life. When we were in youth fellowship, we would go to other churches. We'd go to the churches in D.C., some in PG County. Our pastor insisted that we become involved. And I've met a lot of people that way. They would send me to, I would go to camp during the summer. I know the it wasn't the United Methodist Women, it was Women's Society of Christian Service would sponsor me to go to Princess Anne one summer. I'd go to Morgan State one summer for conferences, and that became a part of my life. When I got to college, I knew a lot of people just because I knew them from activities here in the church. And so, as I said before, the older people here, and of course when you're a child, everybody's old until you become old yourself, but they were interested in what you were doing. Our church was very, very, what's the word I want to use is, nobody said amen or clapped their hands or anything. It was very solemn. And I remember some of the older people, if we laughed, the children laughed, they would turn around and tell you, be quiet, you know. They didn't have that, of course, in these later years. Of course, that went out, that style went out. But we've become a different church. You know, if you come here now, you'd think we were some other denomination rather than United Methodist. But that was our life. We had movies downstairs. Sometimes the youth fellowship would have movies. Our young adults were very active. We had were involved with other churches, and we'd have teas, and we took a trip to New York for maybe 15 years, which only cost us back then $25. I remember so well. $25, and that was for the weekend. And we went to a play and stayed in a hotel for $25. But all of that activity was from the church, from the church.
So your lives centered around it. Did you want to say something?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You finished, Irene? Irene hit upon something I was thinking. Every adult in this church was concerned about all the children. And behavior was very, very good, because we knew, even if my mother wasn't there, that there was someone who would be telling her things that happened. But that was a good feeling, because we felt secure and safe and loved. I remember when I married and had my 2 children, and we would sit in the last pew, and Miss Alma, Irene's mother, would sit in front of us, And every Sunday she'd come in and she'd turn around and she'd speak to my children. And then I'd see her digging in her purse and she'd give them each a coin. And I had them to save it. And they said, why can't we spend it? I said, no, just keep it and see, you know. But that was the love that people had for, and it was just a wonderful feeling, really. I didn't experience a lot that Irene experienced because I was older and those things hadn't come into fruition then, but I had a good life here and I'm still having it.
I think most of the black churches were just alike. We weren't the same denominations, but we did the same kind of things. Church was center of our community. That was our center, and everything that we did important. We did it in the church. And
Let me ask you this. You had said, or one of you had said, it was very segregated time. We all know that.
Oh, yes.
And I think you alluded to, you really didn't have too many other choices. Were you aware, as children, were you aware of the which I call the problems of the bigger society?
I don't think we were, when I was little, this was our situation. We didn't know anything else. This, whatever we had to do, if we were segregated, if we were whatever, it was a part of our life, and in everything that we did, we were segregated. I guess we were grown, and when we went away to college and we found out, lots of other things about the world. But it was just the way we were. It was just the center of our lives. That's what we did.
My step-grandmother lived up in Sugarloaf Mountain, in answer to your question about segregation, and it was so bitter cold. And so one year my father said to my mother, I just don't like her being up there having to get wood and all to keep warm. So he invited her to come to live with us, and she did over a number of years in the winter. And she shared a bed with me, and she told me I was a little oven because I was always so warm. But she was Catholic. And once she asked my father if he would take her to Mass. Well, Mass was at St. Mary's, the small church. And my grandmother was very, very fair in color. And I asked, could I go with her? And she said, oh yes, she was happy about that. I went with her several times, but we had to go in and go upstairs and sit in the gallery. And I could look over and see other people, And so one day when we were going home, I asked her, couldn't we sit downstairs? Because she had arthritis and so forth. And she said, no, we have to sit upstairs. But she didn't tell me why. That was the beginning for me when I was about 8 years old, yes.
Hearing these stories, and you're not the first to be telling me this, that you felt safe, secure, loved, nurtured in your community and in your church. It's a testimony to your parents and your grandparents. I mean, to have the foresight, I think. It's not really a question, but can you reflect back on what your elders' efforts have meant for your lives to create?
My grandmother, I remember being here, and I used to come with her. I don't remember coming in my younger years with my mother, because my mother had to work. My mother worked at Hungerford Tavern. Do you remember Hungerford Tavern here? Oh, you don't remember, but Hungerford Tavern here in Rockville. She worked there, and I guessed she must have been tired and couldn't come, because my grandmother didn't live with us at that time. She lived in Lincoln Park, but my father would pick her up on Sundays and I'd come to church, and that's when I started coming with her. Then later on, when my mother, I guess, worked in the government, then she became active in this church, and my father was active in this church. My father was on the trustee board when we tried to buy the property next door the Peters property, and they wouldn't sell it to us because we were black. And they said some very derogatory things about us, and my father he was so hurt. We had the money, or he said, if the church didn't have the money, we'll have the money. That was what he said. But they wouldn't sell it to us. And he stopped coming to church, tell you the truth about that very thing. He never stopped giving, but he still, because he helped him. The pews here now, in memory of my father, my mother gave them to the church when he died in 1979. And they always contributed. They helped to buy the organ, and my brother and I helped to pay for the piano, and we're always giving and trying to make the church better. And because my life, I'm saved because of this church. I think God has been good to me so far. Oh, he'll be good to me forever, I'm sure, but this is my love. And we had people leaving last year. For what? You know, this is my life. I'm not going anywhere. I've seen at least 10 pastors come here and go, 10 or 12, come and go. And I can't leave. This is my home.
That's nice. Let me switch gears a little. Can you remember, well, you had mentioned a minister already, but can you remember a minister that stands out, or anyone in particular? And
Yes, Irene mentioned Reverend Williams.
okay, tell me about Reverend Williams.
Reverend and Mrs. Williams never had children of their own, but they would foster children to do well. Monetarily, they would give, because when my niece went off to college, he helped her every year that she was there. They were just such warm, loving people. And he was pastor at this church for 18 years, which is really a long time for a minister to stay in one place. And in fact, the building next door, when it became our day shelter for women, I was on the management team, and they wanted to know what were we going to call that building, because it was our old parsonage. And immediately I thought about his wife, Cordelia Williams. She would go up to the bank, grocery shop, and always had her hat on and her white gloves and her purse. Such a dignified lady, first lady. And whenever you'd come by the house, you'd always smell goodies. And she'd invite people in for cinnamon buns or whatever. And so I mentioned it to them. I said, I'd like to, she was so dignified. Couldn't we name it that? So we did. So that's Cordelia House is next door in memory of her. But they would just, and Reverend Hodges too was a wonderful, that's when I joined church at age 15. And there have been others that have been good, but those two, in my mind, really stick out in my mind.
What about music? What role did music play in your lives here at church?
Music was, I think we all had choirs. We didn't have a lot of choirs like we have now, but we had one big choir. I mean, you were a member of the choir, you were somebody. You were different. You were part, and my father-in-law played for our church, I guess maybe 50 years before he passed away. And my father and mother both, they were active. My mother was president of the Ladies' Aid, and my father was superintendent of Sunday school. And they just worked and gave money, and it was just a part of your life. We didn't have lots of things that we could do because we were not allowed to do. We couldn't do it. But we had to make our own things, and we only had so much money. So we were just really hung to our churches. And even at one time, our school was in our church. When this Ku Klux Klan burned our old hall down, we had to go to the church.
Before we get back to music, let me just ask about that. You remember the school being burned.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of that at the time? Can you remember?
Frightened. We were all frightened. We were afraid of the Ku Klux Klan. But we didn't know what they were going to do to us. So we didn't make any fuss about it. We just went right on. We moved the children over to Jerusalem Church, and we kept right on with our church services. During the week it was school. On Sunday it was church. And we just hung back from it. We didn't make any big to-do about it. We knew that was our situation. And we were afraid that if we said anything, we might get hurt or might get our house burned down. Mm-hmm.
And you knew people in the Poolesville community that were part of the Klan?
Yes. Yes. He lived right across the road from my house. He was a farmer. His farm was right across the road from my house. But he never did anything to us. He was never harsh or anything to us. When he turned his farm into a peach orchard, his daughter and his wife took care of the business because he was illiterate. And my brother had to make the signs for him to put down on Route 28, the peaches were ready. And I guess he gave my brother was in 4th grade, he gave him a quarter, I guess, for making all these, 18 by 36 to put on the road, on the telephone pole, so everybody will know that the peaches were ready to serve. But, they never did anything to us. If they did something harsh, then we were afraid. But, ordinarily, we weren't afraid of them.
Did you get any sense that how your parents felt about your neighbor?
You mean behavior of their children?
No, about how your family's relationship with your neighbor across the street. I mean, you said
we were all friendly. And those people who were poor and hungry, we didn't think anything. Go to Miss Sarah's house. That was my mother, and the children, white children and black children, played in our yard, and we didn't think about it. We were all children together, and they never left our house hungry. Mama would put them up to the table, all of them together, and they would eat, and she would be cooking and feeding those children, and when they finished eating, she'd send them home. And their parents never objected to the fact that their children played in our yard with us. We never had any back talk from it. It was just smooth.
And one other thing about that, I understand something about Billy Lynch.
Like what?
Wasn't I supposed to ask her about Billy Lynch? Somebody told, right? Billy Lynch?
Oh, Billy Lynch. Oh, Billy Lynch was a little white boy, and his farm was up the road from us, and Billy played with us every day. And we didn't think anything about Billy Lynch, but the children at school would tease us. Billy Lynch is Nana's boyfriend. What is a boyfriend? We didn't know. I didn't even think about it. I would cry because they would tease me that Billy was my boyfriend. He stayed at our. We didn't ever go to his farm and play. They always came to our house. They sat at the table with us. Whatever we ate, they ate. And my mother never let them go home hungry. All the children that were there, she had 100 of them of her own almost grandchildren, but they were always there, and they would come every day almost. We had.
And didn't you say that sometimes you would see the same kids out elsewhere and you'd have a different relationship with them?
Oh yeah, if they would see you out in public, they wouldn't say anything to you. They wouldn't speak to you or anything. But they played in our yard and ate our food, and we didn't think anything of it. But if they saw us on the street in Poolsville, go on with the head up in there.
It's funny, but it's not funny now. But
It's not a ha-ha thing.
But anyway, let's get back to music, because you look like you really want to say something about music.
In our church now, we have the Chancellor Choir, the Ebony Choir, the Children's Inspirational Choir, the men sing fourth Sunday, and I've been trying to get on fifth Sunday to have a United Methodist Women's Choir. And we have the instruments. That's why when Irene said you wouldn't think we were a Methodist church now from what we used to be, we have a saxophone, we have the piano, we have drums, and the organ. But when I was growing up, I never sang with the choir, but we wanted to have the children involved. So I formed a group. I can't remember what they were called then, but the one song we would always sing, I Want to Be a Sunbeam. And there's one mother, she's dead now, two of her children were in that choir, and until she died, she says, I can still see those children up there singing. Mm-hmm. We would sing every now and then. It wasn't every organized thing. But that gave me a lot of pleasure too, working with them. There were about 8 to 10 children. Mm-hmm. The Israels were in there. Mm-hmm. And it really, music means a lot. Mm-hmm. It
so
really,
when you were a kid, there was a choir when you were little?
No, not when I was little. But
Okay.
as I guess I was about 16 or 17, and we just wanted the children to be involved, because in our Methodist church, every third Sunday, the Inspiration Choir sings. They have the acolytes. The children collect the money, for the offering, and
They do everything.
and they read the scripture. It's their Sunday, and the sermon is usually geared to youth. Yes, because they have to be included also.
Music has always been a part. And when I started here, I guess I started singing we only had one choir when I was younger. I started playing for the choir, the organ, when I was about 12, 13. And we had the old-fashioned pump organ, and it sat up here. And we never sang anything other than what was in that's a newer hymnal from what we used to have. But Reverend Williams was definitely not gospel, not jazz, nothing. What was in the hymnal, we sang. That's why I practically know every hymn that's in that book.
Most churches just had one choir in those days.
We grew up
and
with
then
one
there were
choir.
adults.
Right.
There were adults singing in the choir. We didn't have any children's choir, intermediate choir, just one choir. But it was very important.
Yes.
What does it mean to the congregants to have the music, do you think?
Oh, I think it gears up the service. It's a preparation for when the pastor speaks. The music generates something for the pastor, and other congregants too. Because I know sometimes I look and people are crying. You don't know for what reason, but the music has brought something out that it was maybe asleep, inside. But music is a motivator, to tell you the truth, and I love it.
I'm going to ask about another thing that seemed to be very important to you all and many other people in the county, and that is the Emery Grove Camp meeting. Ooh, see, you all smile.
Dusty shoes. I can remember that.
Tell me-
shoes, white
tell me-
socks, and all the dust.
Tell me when that happened, like what time of year was it, and where was it, and why was it so
It
important?
happened. Let's see. I was going to Lincoln then, so that had to have been in the 40s.
Might have been older than
In
that.
August.
Because
It was in August. The reason I remember, my grandmother, my mother's mother lived with us, and every Sunday she had to take my grandmother to camp meeting, which was in Emery Grove. It's now, the property now is owned by the county.
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, that was big time entertainment for young folks.
I'll tell you, excuse me, Irene, that Emery Grove camp starts so far back in slavery because it was a time when slaves would run away. And they had a man in Sandy Spring called, I can't think of his name, but he would take them to Canada. And they would run away from that camp. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yes they did.
But when you think of Canada, see, I have uncles who left slavery. My grandmother's uncles, really, I'm saying in my mind, but my grandmother's uncle left from Sunshine, that they lived over there off of, what's the name of the road, and still there, and the house is still there. But I don't know where they left from, you know. That's why we have our family reunions now in Canada every 2 years or every 4 years. Yeah. But anyway, we would go, and that's where we would see the kids that we went to school with, high school, because you know we only had one high school. And they came from all of Montgomery County to one high school. So you went to camp meeting and you saw those kids that you had gone to school with, even though you had just left them in June. But in August, you know, and the place didn't have shrubbery and grass and all that, but you dressed. But when you came home, my mother used to say, "What in the world did you do up at camp meeting?" You'd be dusty from head to toe, from your hair, your clothes, your shoes, but you had a good time. And that was every Sunday for, I think, about 4 weeks.
4 weeks.
3 or 4 weeks. But they had services all day and food and ball game and all of that.
It was a big meeting.
It was a big meeting time.
Big time for blacks in Montgomery County.
Right.
And I've told some of my younger relatives, I said, you cannot leave potato salad outside an hour now. But we would take our food with us, and fried chicken and potato salad would sit out all day. And we'd be all over the campground, and we'd come back, and we'd eat, and we'd go again. Because the preservatives, I mean, food wasn't the same then. And no one ever got sick from that food being out all day. And it would be hot, because August is usually warm. Yes.
Those were the days.
Yes.
That's marvelous. It's just seeing your faces light up when I said camp meeting. It was really quite
They still
precious.
have camp meeting, but it's not like it used to be. Because now each community is more separate, do their own, thing now.
You all went to the same high school? Or
We didn't
The
have
one that was available.
Nine, of course, didn't.
Right.
But Annie and I did, and I went here until 10th grade. Then I graduated from school in D.C.
Okay. But given that everybody had to travel to Rockville,
Yeah,
Right.
the
I mean,
best
you
way
kind
you
of had the
could.
good end of the stick,
That's
right?
right.
But Nina, how did you get here?
Well, it just happened when I started. Our parents had bought us an old bus. Oh, we named it was painted blue, old Ford bus, and the paint was flying off it. We named it the Blue Onion because it was peeling just like an old onion. And that's the way I got to school. We had a bus, and he's my brother-in-law. He's dead now, but he was a student in high school. The students drove the buses. We had one bus that a man, and that was in Sandy Spring. He was a grown man, but the other buses where the parents had bought, the high school boys drove us to school. And some of the children stood on the side of the road and thumbed, get there the best way you can, until our parents bought the first buses we had.
after high school, you all went to college, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And went on, you all got teachers. I
Yes.
thought it was just the two, sorry. So when you first started teaching, you were teaching in segregated schools?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So where did you teach, and what was the difference between the schools that the black children could attend and the white children?
Well, I can just relate to what my incident. My husband came here in we moved back here in 1955, and the schools were still segregated here. And when school integrated, he went to Sherwood as a teacher and coach. And he came home the very first day he went over to Sherwood. He came back, and he said, "Irene, you won't believe it." And I said, "What? Did they treat you ugly?" And he was the first black teacher that Sherwood had ever seen. And he said, "You won't believe." He said, "You remember me going?" He used to go all the way into D.C. to buy bats and balls and gloves and all of that stuff to teach the kids or have a team, say, at Carver. He said, "You know that time I was going to D.C. buying that stuff from that sporting goods store?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Sherwood has a room full of balls and bats." He said, "It doesn't make any sense." He said, we have nothing, and they have 10 times as much as as the black students. But he stayed at Sherwood, made a name for himself at Sherwood, and then was offered a job making a little bit more money. So he went with IBM. But he taught at Sherwood for 3 years.
I was fortunate, I think, in that my first job was in a new school. They built 3 schools, one in Emery Grove, Sandy Spring, and Rockville, and I had just graduated. And someone mentioned Dr. Broom. He hired me, and he called me his girl because I was born here in Rockville and grew up and all. And I went as a kindergarten teacher. I had no kindergarten room. I had to be in the all-purpose room, but that was fine. But the same thing occurred when I first started teaching. I had kindergarten children from a large area because the schools were integrated. So those little guys had to come on the bus in the morning. And the first day when it was dismissal time, I said to my principal, "Miss Jones, who's going to stay with the children in the afternoon?" Because I was only part-time. And it hadn't occurred to her. So I said, "I'll stay." So for 3 weeks, I worked all day, but only got paid for half day. And didn't mind because they had no bus to come to pick the kindergartners up to take them home. It was 9 to 3, and that was it. And one day, Mrs. Jones went down to the Board of Education, and Dr. Broom said, "How's my girl doing?" And she said, "Fine, but you know she's working all day." He said, "But she's only getting paid for half day." She said, "Right." She said, "We forgot what we were going to do with those children in the afternoon." He said, "Just a minute." And he walked to personnel office, came back with a little piece of paper, and I was working full time. It takes you months now to try to get paperwork cleared, right? But I mean, that's just how times were, you know. But I enjoyed the 8 years I was there very much. Yes, and we had top everything because it was a new school. Yes, and they wanted these 3 schools to be up to par. I appreciated working there. And then when I went to Darnestown, there was no difference. Lots of construction paper, all the necessary items you needed, you know, and that was good. Right. Yes.
But Nina, you had a slightly different experience. Where did you start your teaching career, and what was it like there?
I started my teaching career at Quince Orchard. The little school is still sitting up there on the side of 28 where I started, and my sister was the maid to one of the Board of Education members, and she told him, "If nobody else gets a job, Dinah Honeyman gets a job." And that's the way this is the lady, that's the way she said she told them. She had 900 gets that job. And so I was teaching at Quince Orchard. And when the war came, they were moving everybody close to home, all the teachers. So I went up, we called it up in the big woods, but it was it was Bellsville. It was farther up north than Peachtree Road. And I went up there and I taught up in the big woods. They closed down Martinsburg, they closed down Poolesville, and brought all the children to the big woods, we call it, but the name of it was Selman. And we were all working there together. And then, let me see, integration came.
Before you talk about integration, you told me that the schools that the black children that you taught in were not as well equipped.
It was not well equipped. We had to use the things that the white children finished with. And they threw it away. They put it in the warehouse, and our supervisor, Mr. Taylor, would go in that warehouse and get whatever we want. Some old used books, some old used everything. And what I did was some of the books had the pages torn out, didn't have all the story. And I would go through that book and take out all the stories that were whole. And the children would make construction paper covers, and that was my library. And it was just stories out of some old books, and the books they didn't have enough, and they were all torn up and everything. So we used the part that we could, and that's the way we went on using until we got these brand new schools, and then we got everything new chairs, new tables, new pot-bellied stoves, and all that kind of good stuff. We had everything new. And I know Miss Throckmorton was she was a principal. She was very strict about the children putting their hands on the wall and make marks on it. Boy, you had to walk past that wall and keep them hands in front. Don't you put your hand on that wall, they'll make a mark on it. We were awed with all the goodies that we had missed all those years. We never had anything new. Everything we had was used. And sometimes dirty, and some of the kids had written their names and messages and stuff all through the book. We had to use them. That's all we had. We didn't have any money to buy any, so we just used it. But then we got new books and new desks and new everything.
But you know, after all of that, we got an education.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we could. We were eligible to go to any college.
Yeah.
Any college that we applied for. Because those old school teachers, they worked hard. They knew. I'm thinking about the old people at Bowie. Those old professors, they knew when we got out there in the country on those one-room schools, and that we weren't going to be having anybody to come and help us, like the reading teacher and the PE teacher and the music teacher come to help you. They knew we weren't going to have it. They taught us all that stuff. We could just do everything. Even we had woodworking. Me doing woodworking. They'd make little bookends and little things like that. They taught us everything because they knew that we would have to do everything by ourselves. We didn't have anybody to come to help us. So we turned out to be real good teachers. Some people thought we weren't going to be good teachers and didn't want their children in our rooms, but they found out we were good. We could do all kinds of stuff. But those old professors taught us everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could do.
I guess it was in the late 50s that the county started to phase in or phase out segregation. It happened.
Carver closed in 61.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 61.
And then kids went, to the schools nearest them.
Mm-hmm. So you made the transition. You already told us about your husband making the transition from Carver to
I never
Sherwood.
went to integrated schools.
Right.
I was working at the funeral home by that time.
I'm going to ask you about that as soon as we get. So, what was your experiences? What were your experiences with when you first started at an integrated school?
Well, I'll say this. There were some schools, parents didn't want their children in black teachers' room. They said they weren't fully educated and they were, they just weren't good teachers. But we went to summer school. I went to summer school. I got all the best stuff I could get. And I think most black teachers did that. And because we knew we had to be ready to know how to do everything. And at the school where I was, the mothers would check the children's homework. What my homework I had given my children, what a white teacher would have given their children, and they were different. They went to their principals or somebody, and I want my child in Miss Clark's room next year because she's doing some things that hadn't been ever done before. Well, I just studied and went and gonna try. I say I got to be the best, and I think all black teachers felt we've got to be good. We've got to know how to do a lot of things because we're not going to get any help. And we did it too. We went to summer school and got more degrees on top of those degrees on top of those degrees. We had them.
You had an experience.
But let me tell you about this one. When integration began, and I did get hired at Darnestown, I was there a few years. Well, I was at Rock Terrace first, but then when they started farming us out, and the enrollment was lowered at Darnestown, only had morning kindergarten. So there was a lady that I'd met in a workshop, and she was a principal now. And I don't know how she heard that I was only working part-time, but she called my principal and said, I have a kindergarten opening. So I went, and it was about 5 minutes from my home in Durwood, Mill Creek. And so I'd go there in the morning, and in the afternoon I was at Darnestown. I team taught with the white teacher, and I was there 6 months, and parents began to request of the principal, couldn't my child go into my room? That made me feel real good because it wasn't a competition kind of thing, but I was organized and I knew the subject matter and I put hours in even though I had a family. But anyway, so that situation was wonderful. But the day that I was assigned to go to Poolesville for my interview was the worst day of my life. Because Poolesville was a very troubled area during that integration period. Policemen would be there if they had a big meeting because they never knew what was going to happen. But I went and I prayed all the way there. It was an unpleasant situation. All this education that I'd gotten, certification, I wasn't going to have a classroom. I was going to be a floater. Well, I knew I was more than a floater. So I didn't argue, didn't show any resistance. We left the situation. I told her I'd let her know, or my principal at that time would let her know if I was going to accept that position or not. As I came out of the schoolhouse, walking toward my car, I could see something coming across the parking lot at a fast pace, and I did like that, and it was a big white dog, and I barely made it into the car and closed the door, and the dog jumped up on the car. And I said, oh my Lord, even the big white dog doesn't want me up here in Poolesville. So I prayed all the way up to Poolesville, being the Christian that I thought I was, but I didn't pray all the way back. I was a little bit unnerved. But I went to the Board of Education and left the superintendent a letter of what had occurred. And I said, if you want someone to go to Poolesville to teach, you go yourself. Now that was gutsy, because I could have lost my job. But he knew what I was going through. And Monday morning, my principal met me and he said, get your children settled and come back to the office. And I did. my mother had been ill and had recovering from a stroke, and she was unnerved about me having to go. First, call your mother and tell her you will not have to go to Poos, that you're not going to Poosville. And I went to Darnestown, and I was there 25 years in integrated situation. I was the only kindergarten teacher, so they had no recourse. But things were so pleasant there, and the people treated me like a human being, and I think appreciated what I was doing with their children. I was invited to college graduations, baby showers, weddings, and I still hear from some of the parents and the children that I taught at at Darnestown. Forgive me, please. And the wonderful outcome of that situation was I taught the principal of the school up here, right up at Bell. I taught his son at Darnestown. So Al knew that I was a good teacher. He told me later that some of the principals were very upset about how I was treated when I went to Poosville. Some of them dug into that female principal's credentials, and she was not qualified to be a principal. So one more year after they found out, she was out of there. And then I told Irene today, I kept watching our state newsletter till I saw her name in the obituary.
And you felt so sorry.
I'm
Well,
finished.
Poosville had a bad name during integration, when integration came, because my husband was teaching at Carver, and when integration came, a lot of his boys were playing sports at Poosville. And he said, Lord, he said, I hope they can do it. But Poosville had a motorcade, came down here to the board to say they didn't want integration. But do you know, after 3 or 4 years, they were over to University of Maryland cheering the basketball team on, and there was more blacks on the team than it was white.
Yeah, I got very good treatment from the parents they gave. I had one parent who invited me to lunch. I was the only black on the faculty. She never invited one of those white teachers. And I never heard them say anything about it unless they talked behind my back. And I would go and she would serve me tomato soup and crackers. Oh, I said, it's just delicious. It's lovely. I would go there to that lady's house, and that's all she had to give me. She's kind of poor. And that's all, I would eat that tomato soup and crackers. And she never invited any of the white teachers to her house. And they treated me just wonderful. They weren't nasty to me. And at Christmas time, I would go home with bags of gifts in both hands, all kinds of gifts. I think they put forth, some of them, forth a hard effort to say, I'm not segregating yourself from me. I'm not that kind of a person. I'm a good person. And they treated me good.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Finally, I didn't have much to work with, but they treated me good. But that lunch was just wonderful.
Yeah.
Tomato soup and crackers.
Just one more thing about teaching. I'm going backwards in time. Do you have memories of the Quince Orchard community? Because we talked to some of the people already for this project, and I'm just wondering, what were your impressions of the Quince Orchard School?
Yeah, but Quince Orchard School was one of Mr. Julius Rosenwald's schools. And it had 2 classrooms and a little kitchen in the middle. We were supposed to have had a library in those schools, but we didn't have library. We had a kitchen or something like that, a stack room. But I didn't have any trouble with it. It was segregated. When I was at Quince Orchard, very segregated. And I never had any trouble.
Not trouble, but what impressions of the community or the kids or any memories from there?
The parents usually were very kind to us. I had a parent that used to bake me chocolate cakes, and I like greens. She would go out and get watercress out the fields, and she'd cook it, and some kind of little boy come with a big pan of watercress that she had cooked for me, and I'd have chocolate cake, and once a year she would bring all of the teachers those were in high school, those were in elementary school, bring them to her house and had the big dinner she had been cooking for days. And we would, and all of us would have something to carry home. We'd have a cake or pie or baked chicken. I mean, that lady would feed us up. And they were the children, high school teachers and the elementary teacher, get them all cooked together and have this big dinner for us.
You've had quite a bit of successes. You, an author, you've had the years at Darnestown felt, so appreciated in your family business.
Well,
what part does the church play in your success? Does that make sense?
Yes. If a church does its job, I feel that about 80% of the people who go there could be successful if they follow what they're taught from the Bible. And I always had a feeling of closeness, and we did the Bible and the graces and just prayer in general. I tell some people I even thank the Lord when I find a parking space. Because the malls, and I'm with a cane, and sometimes if I feel good, then I'll park a couple spots away and walk to try and get exercise. But the church plays a big part in our entire life.
Church and the school.
And yes, church and school, if we accept it. It's there for us, but we have to absorb it and live by
the church,
the doctrine.
Yeah, the church. When I finally went to work with my parents in the funeral home, when I would, of course, the church is always the end of a person's of say a funeral in their life. I've been to so many different churches, but my background here, I knew what a service was. I've been to churches where I ended up having to play for the service. I had to read the papers. I had to help the minister and all of that, but only because I had a great foundation here, and I knew what a religious setting was all about. I used to even do the ushering. I knew what ushers were supposed to do. I knew what the candles on the altar, and I'd have to say, "Young man, can't you light those?" A lot of churches didn't do that. But my background here in this church was so that I could help others. And I know I've been to practically every church, every Methodist church, and every Baptist church in the county.
Nina, you were going to say something, I think, also about how the foundation that you got at church influenced your life, made you the person.
Well, school and church were two most important things in our life. We would just sort of link together, the church and the school. Whatever we did at church, we had things that we did at school, like we had a big program for Christmas and Easter and Children's Day. But it was the people who went to church with us that were our teachers in Sunday school, and they helped us to learn the music. We had a teacher, we call him Mr. Charles. Mr. Charles could not play an instrument. He was helper in my father's Sunday school. Mr. Charles could pick up a piece of music and look at it and sing it right off. Mm-hmm. Couldn't play an instrument at all, and he taught us all of our Christmas music, and he was the teacher in the community. So the church and the school were linked in there, and he would teach us all of our Christmas music, all of our Easter music, all of our Children's Day. We had a Children's Day in June, and he would teach us all that music, and he would sing it to us, and we would sing it back to him until we learned it. So
and how did all of that influence who you became?
Well, once upon a time I might have thought about it, but in my day, there wasn't anything else that an educated black woman could do other than teach school. And they always put it in my head, you're going to be a teacher, my teacher would call me my little teacher. And I always just felt that it was the thing, if you are educated, it isn't anything else you can do. You're not going to work in anybody's office. You're not going to do anything important. You're going to teach school. That's all an educated black woman could do.
But that's pretty important,
Yeah.
teaching school.
When I was very young, I always wanted to be a nurse. And the war, some of my classmates, the males, went off to war in World War II. And I couldn't wait because I wanted to go in the Nurse Cadet Corps. And my father wouldn't sign for me. He said, that's not a place for a young lady. And I said, okay, then I'll be an old teacher like my grandfather. My grandfather was a teacher. So I went off to college, but it was a godsend because when I married, I couldn't even pull my children's teeth. I was that squeamish, you know, and they were cut. I was so glad that he, for many reasons, that he did object to my going off to be a nurse because I had 31 years of wonderful experiences, yes.
Tell me why you think it's so important that these churches are kept alive.
Well, that it was the church was the foundation of the black family. That was the only thing that the black people owned was their church and a log cabin. But it's also the church, everything important they did, it was in the church. So it was really the center of the activity in our community. And, you know, we had to use the church for school and everything like that. Everything important that went on, we did it in the church. It was the center of our existence.
And you don't want to lose that.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.